As you know, we've been going through Delivered Out of Empire by Walter Brueggemann, subtitled Pivotal Moments in the Book of Exodus, Part 1. And this is something I read last lesson with an added paragraph to the end, but I felt it was also, for this chapter, necessary to say. Before we dive in, I'd like to remind us from the onset of the Jewish tradition of Midrash. If you remember, that's the tradition that carves out room for us to question and critique ideas discussed in the biblical text. We might not always like or feel comfortable with every depiction of God and God's actions we encounter in the Bible. I would say that today's story and the stories we've been considering are no exception. And the Jewish tradition of Midrash says that's okay. And this would even be a tradition that would carry on into the ways that Christians study the Bible, with this understanding that the learning and the wisdom is gleaned by way of these harsh critiques and the discomfort and the honest questions. So we don't have to like or take at face value everything we read in the Bible. And I know that modern biblical fundamentalists would insist otherwise, that you have to take at face value and to just cope with it. But those ideas are fairly new and historically novel, and I would even go so far as to say, as given the broader look at Christianity, unorthodox. And the story that we'll be considering today contains elements that many find unsettling, even unbelievable. Keep in mind, these are stories that Israel spun or told about their past centuries after these events were to have taken place. To these ancient storytellers, the story's historicity did not matter so much as what they revealed about Yahweh's priorities and desires for the people of Israel. And these stories were first put to parchment in the 6th century BCE during the time of Israel's captivity by the Babylonian Empire. And they would serve at once as a critique of Babylon's ways as they compared to Egypt's. And they would have found in these stories hope for themselves. And these stories would help those in captivity find faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and maybe perhaps believe that their liberation might happen as well. And as for we modern readers, I'm sure that the actions of God in these stories will be more than unsettling. The killing of the firstborn, even of the prisoners and the slaves, which is a detail that I missed in prior readings, especially popped out in chapter 11, which was not required for this week, but is required 2 weeks from now. Well, those details of the killing by the angel of death, by God's agency, of those who were no doubt oppressed by the ways of Egypt and Pharaoh as well, they strike me as unjust and unfair. And as we proceed, we will try to discern what the intended takeaways from the story are meant to be, whilst also leaving room to claim the unsettling nature of the narrative and to not discount or discard that. What I was about to say at the beginning of the lesson, before I really got going, was that this particular plague, the 10th plague, the killing of the firstborn, that comes up in a big way in chapter 7 and a little bit next week as well. So the deep dive into that part of the story, I would like us to postpone until we read chapter 7, because the author, Walter Brueggemann, deals with it more there than it does today. Although if it comes up, it's hard to avoid, actually, because it is part of today's story. But we're not going to get it all fleshed out today. And I don't think there are really any truly satisfactory answers to a story like that. Anyway, I digress. Let's proceed. Chapter 5. And this one is called Narrative as Curriculum. And by that, he means the story itself serves primarily as a teaching tool for future generations. And the pivotal text he highlights for today is the first 2 verses of chapter 10, which reads, "Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his officials, in order that I might show these signs of mine among them, and that you may tell your children and grandchildren how I have made fools of the Egyptians, and what signs I have done among them, so that you may know that I am the Lord." The last chapter's pivotal verse marked the moments when Pharaoh was clearly bested by the might and power of Yahweh. You may remember 2 weeks ago, or maybe more, from that lesson, that pivotal verse was about the moment when the Pharaoh's magicians could not conjure the gnats, could not best or at least equal Moses and Aaron in the third plague. And this marks a decisive turn in the narrative. And so the decisive turn in the contest between Yahweh and Pharaoh is marked by this. I'm going to quote Brueggemann. He says, "It is clear that the third plague, the conjuring of gnats, marks the decisive turn in the narrative, and so the decisive turn in the contest between Yahweh and Pharaoh. With its breathtaking verdict, they could not. We know that Pharaoh has been defeated and is no match for Yahweh." That's from this week's chapter, but it's about last week. And this raises a question. If Pharaoh had been bested, and if his fate is more or less certain so long as he continues to resist Yahweh, then why drag out this melodrama for an additional 6 plagues? To this question, Brueggemann responds, "The reason for the extended narrative that seems not to be required by the plot after chapter 8, verse 18, is in order to provide a curriculum for intentional instruction. It is as though we need 10 plagues in order to feature 10 dramatic scenes, perhaps to offer 10 sequential lesson plans, the subject of which is the exhibition of Yahweh's transformative power." Pages 34 and 35. Allusions to this purpose being instruction for future generations, specifically children, are found in verses like chapter 12, verse 26, and chapter 13, verse 8, where the author imagines the sort of questions children may pose in the future about these events. And the answer to these questions is the Exodus story itself, along with a pointed emphasis on the importance of remembering these things. The Exodus story demonstrates the power of Yahweh to liberate the people and to best the tyrant. In the retelling and in the reenactment of these events by way of future Passover meals, the people are given hope in the face of adversity and struggle. And the questions that are brought up in chapter 12, verse 26 and 13:8 have been woven in paraphrased form in modern Seder suppers that Jewish people celebrate around, that Jewish people participate in around Passover, which is about the remembering of the story. Here is a longer quote from page 38. Writes Brueggemann, "The gift of such remembering and retelling is hope. In every circumstance, Israel could hope in the conviction that the God who anciently performed miracles is fully able to do so yet again. Thus, in the book of Lamentations, in the midst of devastation and destruction, the poet in Israel could fall into despair, but then remember and hope." And here, Lamentations chapter 3, verses 18 through 23 are quoted. "So I say, glory, gone is my glory, and all that I had hoped for from the Lord. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." To which Brueggemann responds, "Hope in the midst of devastation clusters around the most trusted markings of Yahweh: steadfast love, mercy, and faithfulness." And so these stories serve as a demonstration of God's stalwart resolve to liberate the people. Brueggemann writes, "The alternative to remembering is forgetting. To forget is to live in a world without signs and wonders, to become stubborn and rebellious, to lose the capacity for steadfastness and faith, the markings of Yahweh that are celebrated and imitated in faithful Israel. The Deuteronomist warns of the perils of forgetting that Yahweh has done." And I'm going to quote from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 8, verses 11 through 18. And this is to flush out the stakes. What's at stake when the people forget where they've been and how God has been there for them in the past? It reads, "Take care that you do not forget the Lord your God by failing to keep his commandments, his ordinances, and his statutes, which I am commanding you today. When you have eaten your fill and have built fine houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks have multiplied, and your silver and gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then do not exalt yourself, forgetting the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness, an arid wasteland with poisonous snakes and scorpions. He made water flow for you from flint rock and led you in the wilderness with manna that your ancestors did not know, to humble you and to test you, and in the end to do you good. Do not say to yourself, my power and the might of my own hand have gotten me this wealth. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, so that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your ancestors, as he is doing today. In this story, this is why this story as curriculum is important, because the stories themselves, without having to lay it out in detail as bullet points, as statements or axioms, the story itself and remembering the story is meant to be the teaching tool. And to that I say, okay, fine. I understand how the story calls us to remember the power and wonders of Yahweh, but why did Yahweh need to lay it on so thick? You may recall how during the last lesson I used a boxing match as a metaphor to describe this sparring between Pharaoh and Yahweh. And we've already noted how in chapter 8 it became apparent that Yahweh had won when Pharaoh's magicians could not produce gnats as Moses and Aaron had done. So to stick with the metaphor of a boxing match for a moment, here's where the referee may well have called the match, but this does not happen. In a modern boxing match, when the ref does not call the match, when it becomes clear that it is over, usually that ref is given a scathing critique by those who like boxing and watch boxing, because, it's time to put a pin in it at some point. But here, it's drawn out. Even the servants and those who work in Pharaoh's palace know it's done, and even at one point implore him to just let the people leave into the wilderness to worship their God, but he will not. And we'll find as we go forward that this is because at this point, going past the fourth plague, Yahweh begins to harden Pharaoh's heart, sort of entrenching him in his own decision to have his heart hardened himself before. So as things progress, the plagues will become increasingly more severe. And what's more, at first, Pharaoh seems to have volition in the previous encounters, hardening his own heart to the works of Yahweh. And last lesson, we had several moments where this was the case. Some verses where this is the case, chapter 7, verse 22, chapter 8, 15, 8, 19, 8, 32, 9, verse 12, and then chapter 9, verse 34, each corresponding to a response to the plague. Pharaoh sees what happens and he hardens his heart. But now it would seem as though Yahweh honors Pharaoh's desires by reinforcing what he seems to want, a hard heart. And here I've cited several examples where it is Pharaoh who hardens his own heart. Or where it is, I said that wrongly, where it is Yahweh who hardens Pharaoh's heart. In chapter 11, the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart even in the face of the possible annihilation of all the firstborn in Egypt. Why is this done? And Brueggemann answers this question in such a way as to help us understand the author's intent in organizing the story this way, and also what the early readers would have gotten from it. And so while we might find, I do find the plagues, the livestock being killed, the picture earlier of a livestock covered in boils, as if that cow had done anything wrong. All of these things really, really unsettle me. What we're going to try to do here is to try to understand the overarching point of the story, in spite of those details, even though the details do disturb me. So I'll just own that from the onset. One may see this as God giving Pharaoh a hard heart, the heart that he desires, honoring and abetting his stubbornness. However, another reason is stated in the text. The Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not listen to you, in order that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. So that my wonders may be multiplied. This suggests that the point of the final plagues is to display the power and the might for their own sake. The display of power and might itself is the reason for this continuing, to show future generations just how large, how grandiose, how powerfully God will take action in the world on behalf of the people who are enslaved. And so that's why the plagues are increasingly more severe. Brueggemann writes, the curriculum of Exodus 10, 1 through 2 concerns the signs that are performed in the plague narrative enacted by Yahweh, who is the refuge and defender of the poor. Those signs show the way in which Yahweh made fools of the Egyptians. The term rendered made fools suggests not of harsh treatment, that is, I abused the Egyptians. The effect of such harsh treatment is to confound the one acted upon by the verb. Thus, the plagues in general and the could not of 8:18 in particular expose Egyptian claims to power, prestige, wealth, and wisdom to be a collage of empty posturing. It's as though the plagues expose Pharaoh as an emperor who has no clothes. So now, after the plagues, Pharaoh is a fool. And so the plagues are to further demonstrate the inadequacies of Pharaoh's worldview, Pharaoh's perspective, the lie that Pharaoh is the God emperor. In other words, the purpose of the narrative and the gravity and magnitude of the plagues is to demonstrate the power and strength of Yahweh over and above the evil empires and rulers, past and present. All in all, Brueggemann wants to point out that the main purpose of these texts is to instruct future generations of Israelites and to remind them of how Yahweh had advocated for them in the past and to give them hope in their current circumstance. It bears reminding once again that these stories were first put to parchment and told in their current form in the midst of Israel's Babylonian captivity and diaspora. The point seems to be there is no limit to the distance God will go or the effort God will exert to free the oppressed. Brueggemann writes, page 41, in the end, the aim of the teaching is that Israel, generation after generation, may know the Lord. The entire narrative is designed to create wonder, awe, thanks, praise, and obedience for a world that is inimical to that of Pharaoh. No one could understand how Israel was able to depart Pharaoh's brickyard. No one could explain how Moses and Aaron exercised such effective authority. Israel could only tell and retell again and again. That is why we love to tell the story. That is why we've a story to tell the nations. The narrative curriculum has a different kind of authority and a subversive power that eludes the censors of empire. Where such retelling occurs, there is the offer of hope and obedience, the ingredients to an alternative life of freedom, justice, and finally, shalom. So I ask that you unmute yourselves as we discuss the questions for discussion. The narrative of the 10 plagues and all the signs and wonders throughout Scripture are described in this chapter as a curriculum that God's people should use to remind future generations of God's faithfulness and all-surpassing power. Why are narrative and reenactment, rather than argument or explanation, such a compelling way to communicate God's transformative power to those who may not have experienced it directly? How do stories like the plague narrative stir up hope in hearers by calling them to remembrance? What stories of God's faithfulness in the Bible, in your life, or in the lives of past generations, stir up hope in you? So there's several questions in there, and I invite you to respond to any or all of them as you feel ready, or if you want to at all.
Like in the case of the plagues, it would be very hard to explain how it happened. I mean, you could tell it, but explaining how all that happened is just kind of impossible.
Good point. When I took a class on the book of Revelation, which models these plagues, in many ways there's echoes of these plagues in the book of Revelation, as judgment poured out on the Roman Empire is the focus of the writer of the book of Revelation. One of the things that I learned was what was meant by the plagues, what was meant to be conveyed by the plagues, which in that case was judgment on empire, exploitation of the merchant class, and all that Rome was doing. The plagues were powerful in Revelation, function as powerful metaphors for the ways that God felt about those sorts of things. And in this case, the point Brueggemann is making is, as a teaching tool, the how it happened. I will not go so far as to say the what that happened, but the how that it happened is not so important as what does it say about God's passion for liberating the people. And as the plagues escalate in scale, the answer is God feels quite strongly about this, and then some. Now, the reason I didn't go so far as to say that the what happens is not so important is I actually think you can take stories that are or writings in the scriptures that can serve as a parabolic metaphor, and you could critique the parabolic metaphor in our own times and say, is that really the best way to convey what is trying to be said here? For example, one that's often cited is in the Psalm, I believe it's Psalm 96, but I'm willing to be I'm willing to be corrected on that. But it's the one where in Babylonian activity, the psalmist writes, I sat by the banks of Babylon and wept. And after lamenting the fall of his home, says, what I want to do is bash Babylonian babies' heads against rocks. Now, one can understand that sort of passion and that sort of anger and that sort of heartbreak. If you've lost your own home and even had your own children killed, you can understand it. But I once read how sometimes that has been taken as a metaphor for sin. Like what we want to do is destroy the sin. And I thought to myself, find a better metaphor. I mean, I get what you're trying to say, but there are different ways of saying it. And what I'm wanting to do with these plagues, especially the killing of the livestock, which had nothing to do with it, and the firstborn, even of the slaves and those in prison, the text says, I'm wanting to say is I can remain unsettled by that and even hold on to my conviction that God is not a God who murders the innocent. I mean, come on. And also get the point for the people in captivity, in the Babylonian captivity, and in the people who have been enslaved by empires like Egypt, or Egypt, in fact, that the heart of God passionately yearns and strives for, and the purposes of God and the will call us to liberation. So I can get both.
Yeah.
Both.
I think that because we have not been enslaved, I mean, we might think that our liberty's been taken away at various times. We've had to comply with laws and rules and things that make us feel like we're grouchy and grumpy and we don't want to do that or this or stand in line or whatever we have to do. But truth is, I have never experienced slavery where I've been hopeless and demeaned and humiliated and truly been subjected to horrible things. We can't know what kind of experience this was like for the Israelites in Egypt. And it may have been such a horrible trauma and strain and stain on their people that they needed these kinds of stories to help them feel uplifted or supported or liberated by God. And it makes me think about how slaves in this country felt so uplifted by these same stories. It would have been a blooming miracle to get them out of slavery in the ways that they were treated. I mean, mothers were separated from their children. Families were, they were completely at the whims of their owners, how they were separated and it could count on nothing. And, it might take these kinds of stories to make them feel like, yeah, God is with us. God will repair us. God will deliver us from these evils. And the hearts of the owners might have to be hardened in this way in order for them to get it, that God is on our side. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I've never experienced anything like this. So it might take a story like this for me to feel hopeful that, God is going to take care of me in the end. I don't know. It occurs to me that way. Not that literally I think these things are going to happen or they did happen, but the story itself might be enough.
You're hitting the nail. Go ahead.
I was just saying, Judy brought up the part about slaves in our country, and when they were out in the fields, what did they do? They sang spirituals, things that they'd been told about God and his faithfulness.
So we have the luxury of seeing these stories from the vantage point of a middle-class Egyptian, just sort of like letting these things play out around us. And that's where, I think you hit the nail exactly on the head, Judy, that if you had a child ripped from your arms, and in the meantime, the slave owner's child of privilege, the one who, your child may be the slave owner's child, in fact, because slave owners would often make babies with their own slaves. But then you have the child of privilege living in the house who is like your child will never, all of your children have his last name, but there's only one that seems to matter is going to inherit the plantation. And for something to be done to dismantle that power structure in such a visceral way would mean something entirely different than me, who might live in the town down the road. But I think you got it exactly right. And that's where the message of the stories can reach us all, when we begin to ask, what is this saying about God in the big picture? And to not the details matter, but I think that we can be unsettled from these personally, but also get the main points and be encouraged by them. And I think that if we were in different sociological positions or lived in different times in history, then we would be less troubled by the by what happened here.
Yeah. Right.
I don't know what it means to sit by the
Talking,
banks.
but she's muted.
What's that?
Sue is talking, but she's muted.
Oh, okay. I can't see your faces.
Yeah.
Oh, there she
I
is.
think he has 10 plagues because these Israelites have been 400 years suppressed from knowing God. They've gone farther and farther and farther away from God. And this is a way of God saying, see, this is what I do. This is what the power that I have. And then when he makes the plagues only happen on the Egyptians and not on them, then, that's even showing more favoritism to the Israelites. And as far as the firstborn, I just wonder if this is not, since everything in the Bible is connected, is it connected with the death of Jesus, God's son dying as well? I don't know.
There have been people who have made that connection. As far as just taking the story, in isolation from other things that, will happen later, being the Christian scriptures, the role of the firstborn, as we have learned through other lessons, especially through Genesis, was the firstborn son specifically was to be the heir and the favored one, going forward. And so it's really a dagger deeper into the heart to select that son. It would not be uncommon for, as we've seen in other biblical stories, for fathers to prefer the eldest over the others, and so it just seems to be a way of ratcheting up the despair of Pharaoh. Go ahead.
No, but wasn't there a decree about the firstborn being taken out when Moses was born? Isn't that why he was put in the reeds? I mean,
that's what I was about to say. Is the story begins with wailing and weeping amongst the Israelites, and the cries of the Israelites bring God down. And one of the things that happens in the first part of the story is that Pharaoh, feeling threatened by the numbers of the descendants of Joseph, having forgotten Joseph, decrees that the firstborn, it may have been every male child, actually, now that I'm thinking about
male child.
Okay. I think it was every male child.
Every male child.
But still, It's all bad.
It's all bad.
Male child.
And then Herod put the hit out on every, was it firstborn male child, or was it just every male child?
Every child under the age of 2.
No.
Every boy child under the
Boy
age of
child.
2.
Yeah, every boy child under the age of 2.
Yeah.
Yeah, if it's a baby boy, kill him. If it's a girl, let her live. That was the order in Egypt. Well, this question really asks what sort of stories about God's faithfulness in the Bible and in your life or in the lives of past generations stir up hope in you. And stories back to what you said earlier, Judy, these stories carry less magnitude by virtue of my place in life. I was born into a middle-class Midwestern household, and have faced relatively little adversity. Certainly not on the scale of what's talked about in this story, as far as the Israelites in Egypt. And so I am often inspired by stories in the Bible or by people who live well in the world and bravely. But I think these stories would mean more if I had gone through more. And I'm not daring life to throw me anything, but
I agree with you. Yeah, very much. And I think, I had the opportunity to be with a Jewish family at a Seder and participate in the first night Seder. And it seemed so meaningful to them. I mean, they did the whole ritual with the Seder, and they had the plate that you saw. We had the picture of the plate with the different things, and they explained what they were for. I was like, oh, I had no idea, really. And for them, it really was a meaningful tradition that they passed on to the children who participated, who read what they needed to say, whatever it came, was it Deuteronomy? I'm not sure where the passages that they read came from, but it was really a thing. I mean, it was definitely something that they carried on in the family, and they were going to keep on carrying it forward through generations, and directly came from this. And so, they didn't forget. They were not forgetting. And it had meaning for them, and it really was all novel.
I think for me, the meaning and takeaway, because I like you guys haven't been in that position, but knowing these stories, if I was ever in that position, these stories would be uplifting for me in that time, whatever the time was, whatever circumstance it is, maybe not to that extent, but the fact that that there is that hope. And if you don't have the story, what do you fall back on?
Mm.
Well, come to think of it, in modern times, these families had lived through the Holocaust. I know they knew people who had died. They had people who knew people, or they had relatives. So I don't know. It occurs to me now that was also true. So there was still a need for these stories.
And I think maybe by reiterating Pharaoh's unwillingness to see, inability to see. I'm not sure I think it was an inability to see, because he was so entrenched in his history and tradition of how things were supposed to be as a ruler, and obviously to the point of misusing that power, and possibly that's why that part of the story is in there, that it was all encompassing. There was no exception. And some of those people maybe that did not have their doors marked didn't do it on purpose because they were afraid. They were afraid that Pharaoh was going to be victorious, and then where would they be?
You do have a clear identifier of which side you fall on by way of who marks the doors.
Right. Of course, that doesn't explain, like you said, the animals and the people in prison who, were totally innocent, had no way of protecting themselves.
It's somehow that picture I showed of the donkey really got to me. It's a cartoon even, but I was like, why is that donkey all covered in boils? Like,
I know.
But remember, the livestock were the means of production for the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh's whole system was set up in a way to ensure that he was sitting on top of a big pile of resources. And so that's the point of connection, I think. That's why the livestock play into this story.
I would assume too that the more instances that happen, the more plagues that happen, energized the people to realize that they could make a stand. More and more, they were getting more and more support within their community to get out, to leave when it was time to leave. Because I imagine that at the beginning, there were probably a lot of slaves that weren't on board with it.
Good.
Because
Yeah.
that's the only life they knew.
As a matter of fact, that's what happened. If you remember, the first thing, they're really annoyed when Pharaoh gets mad and tells them that they're going to have to make more bricks with no straw. They're like, "Get out of here! Like, what are you doing, Moses? Like, you're a maniac and you're making things worse."
Exactly.
And by the time it's all said and done, they're champing at the bit to get out. Well, let's move on. I said I'm going to skip the second question because the second question about what happens when people forget the power of God and how this negatively affects things is, and it cites Psalms 10 and 14, is answered by the first sentence in this one. So I'll just read that as the answer that the author gives, and then we'll answer the rest of the questions in question 3. It reads, "Those who forget the signs and wonders of God," says the author, "are prone to becoming fools who believe solely in their own power and entitlement. They will eventually be exposed as helpless, just as Pharaoh was. In our own time, how might we retell the wonders of God in a way that helps expose the false posturing of the powerful systems around us? If the aim of retelling this narrative curriculum is to help others come to know God, what do you think knowing God looks like or could look like in our society or culture?"
Is a little bit harder. Neutrons is the nucleus of it. So if you're an M&M fan, maybe you remember that.
I think the way we treat other people,
Say more.
when we see someone that needs help, the grocery cart is tipped over and everything's falling out, and you go to help. Just little things, just like that guy on that interstate that shared the food he had in his truck where the cars around him. It says, "I care." And that's what God does. God cares for us. It's just like the pantry is there to help people that are struggling. I think when we, as the scripture says, when you give someone a drink, you're giving me a drink. When you visit someone, you're visiting me. And just visiting people that are sick gives them a positive hour or two where they're not thinking about how sad they feel all the time.
So what I hear you saying, the way that we go ahead, Larry. What's that?
We're on our way to Hope and Michael's with the food, so take care, and we'll catch you next time around.
All right, catch you later, Larry. But so what I hear you saying, Sue, is that in living out the love of God, we tell the story through our actions, that we become, I like to think of it as we're the most recent chapter in the story, and in our actions, should they be written down, should reflect older themes of God's love and action in the world. And to be the body of Christ is to be the embodiment of the actions of Jesus Christ in the world. And So we sort of live out the story is what I hear you saying.
Yeah. So to the person that you're showing a kindness to, it's a miracle to them that someone is willing to spend their time, energy, and effort to help or to just share time with them.
Well, I'm going to bring you all back so I can see your faces since we've read that last question. There you are.
I was thinking in terms of, I was talking about how the power takes over in the wrong way. I mean, we have eliminated prayer in the schools. We've taken commandments down. We've made it so we can't have manger scenes on the public lawns, and all those kind of things set the tone, though, for a lot of people who have no church background at all, and they see these things that they think are the norm, which are the norm in some ways.
It's taking the 10 Commandments.
I don't know if that really.
Children no longer do not know that you're not supposed to go around and shoot people when you get mad at them, because that's what they do now.
Well, and I'm thinking of January 6th last year. I mean,
oh yeah,
the takeover, the power, we can do whatever we want kind of thing. And I'm sure those people aren't, thinking of God and his wonderful ways,
There's a lot to unpack there. The reason why the Supreme Court ruled on prayer in schools was because Protestants were from, it's called the Regents Club up in New York, or Regent, I forget exactly. I don't believe it's an affiliate of Jerry Falwell's Regent University, but it bears the same name. They had a very specific Protestant prayer that was so void of theological content that even Jewish people and Christian people and people of various faith traditions said, this is like a nationalistic, this is like Captain America in a prayer. And it's so void of significance and meaning. It's an insult to our religion. And in the meantime, who decides what we pray in school? Are we going to pray the rosary? Are we going to pray with the triune, in the name of the triune God, or in the name of Jesus? And we'd rather leave the prayer to the students and let students have Bible studies, which they're able to do. See you at the pole, gather around the flag, they can pray, and have no prescribed prayers from the top is sure. What that was primarily about. As far as the 10 Commandments going up in courtyards and different places like that too, it's interesting because while the calls to not kill are poignant and seem to be forgotten, the fourth commandment to honor the Sabbath, like I wonder what in this land that fetishizes commerce and productivity, like could learn from if they actually took that seriously. I have mixed feelings about that on both directions. But I think your main, and also to tag it on, many of the people at the January 6th insurrection were self-identified Christian nationalists, Christians who believed that was why they were, which I might say, you're my brother and sister in Christ, I disagree with your application in spades.
Well, the fact that they attacked people and hurt people, that's not the Christian way to go about it.
Which was, I think, your point, Janet, which was that if we were a society that was really taking these things seriously, and taking monuments or no monuments on courtyard lawns, if we were really thinking about what it means to thou shalt not kill or to tell the truth, then we would be different. And I think the evidence is all around us. I just find the irony in some people insisting on a return to basic principles, except for the few that they don't like, which I guess in the case of when I think of honor the Sabbath day, keep it holy, if you flush that out, where it's tied in with commandments to completely shut down your commerce to zero. You're not producing, you're resting on this day. The same people that are trying to, that have led to a return to a 7-day work week as the only viable economic model. I think they would not like it.
We can't really say, I mean, we need our medical people on the Sabbath just as well as during the week. And we need our police people out there protecting us, and our emergency people in case there's an accident on the road or fires.
Firefighters.
We you know, and I think it was Paul that said that every day is holy to God, and we need to honor every day.
My point is, it's in the 10 Commandments, right? And that's what we're talking about this moment. And there are provisions in the Torah for what to do when your oxen falls in the pit. There's an emergency that you must, and I think that what you're talking about would be fit in that category. I'm more talking about Amazon delivery. I'm talking about Walmart open any time of the day, 24/7, including Christmas. I'm talking about what seems to be at the heart of the command, which is the need for humans to be able to take a breath and enjoy creation. Yeah. And we're off on a tangent. I'm off on my own tangent. I apologize. But I find it ironic that, I mean, that politicians who would decry the removal of the 10 Commandments on courthouse lawns, because we should all agree: don't steal, don't murder, don't lie.
Well, the golden rule is not something that should offend anybody. And there isn't any reason why that cannot be posted and taught to our children.
You know what? That comes from, actually, the golden rule it predates even Judaism, where it's voiced in Hammurabi's code. It's in the Jewish writings. Jesus holds it up, and I think that's who could disagree with do to other people what you would have done to yourself.
Well, I think there's another principle here that is constitutional, and we don't have time to discuss it, and that is separation of church and state. And so you can't, I mean, we have so many people's faiths in this country, and we say we support all of them, and so we can't impose, one religion on another, and so we uphold all of them. And therefore, broadcasting that this government is Protestant or this government is Christian or is maybe not necessarily the thing that should be done. I mean, we certainly, I think it's a good idea to say we are moral. I mean, that's absolutely true. We don't steal, we don't lie, we don't kill, we uphold life, we uphold dignity of people, and we are moral. We are moral in our decisions, we are moral in the ways we make laws. And I think that was the original intention of our founding fathers. I think they deliberated long and hard about how to set up our government. And when we say we can't put things on courthouse laws, I think that's something we all have to debate about in really conscious ways and not take offense when it's not really clear, it's muddy, and we have to figure it out. And so, there are a lot of people here that we need to respect and show appreciation for. And it's a moral discussion. It doesn't say that we are abolishing morality when we say, no, maybe not the best thing for our entire community to have, the 10 Commandments or whatever on this lawn, because in this community, maybe that isn't the right thing from, the freedom of all people from a constitutional perspective. And I don't know. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a constitutional scholar. I just listen to people who speak about these things. And so I think that when we start mingling religion, not morality, but religion in government, it starts becoming a slippery slope. So that's all I know.
I kind of just threw out those two instances, but I just think there's a move away from the godly. Our prisons, I mean, you said that we are moral. Yes, a lot of us are, but my goodness, our prisons are just full of people who aren't maybe moral. They try to take advantage, they shoplift, they, seemingly have no what we would call good training.
Mm-hmm.
Well, these are all topics to bring. You're right, Jan. We're missing the forest from the trees when in regards to what you really meant, which was you named a few specifics, but the broader picture was that when people leave the principles of the God who made us, capitalizing the golden rule and statements like the 10 Commandments as purposes to live, ways to live by, then we find a society that is exactly as the psalmist was describing in Psalm 10 and 14, that is divided, predatory, coming apart at the seams. And I think we all sense, I hope we're sensing it stronger than the reality suggests, but it feels like things are not well. And I think actually know that things, I pray for a revival. But
had a person tell me one time that the schools need to teach the children to respect people. And I looked them right in the eye and I said, no, the children need to know, respect people before they ever get to school. And I think that's a part of the problem.
And I think, Sue, what you were saying about showing the light of God by doing these acts of kindness. I mean, that was, that's exactly right. You share the light of God, the love of God by being with people and doing those kind things. I mean, that is a beautiful way. I mean, being a parent and parenting your children right is the very foundation. And sometimes right now we don't have ways for parents to be good parents for lots of reasons. So there's a societal thing that we've got to foundationally change. But then, I mean, that example you gave was, I think, exactly right. We've got to share that love and that light every way we can, just by being with people and just by sharing the good. So I think there are lots of ways that we can help change this. So anyway, there's hope.
It's 3:00. I'll conclude up with an anecdote relating to what we just talked about, but not really germane to the main point. I think we covered a lot of ground, and you probably know this, so maybe just repeating something you already know. But the phrase separation of church and state, or a wall of separation between church and state, is from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to a church in Danbury, Connecticut, the Congregationalist Church in Danbury, Connecticut. It's a distant cousin of the disciples of we disciples. And they wrote to Thomas Jefferson because they were concerned about persecution they were facing in their own community from another religious body. That other religious body were the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut. And that's where we get this idea of, like, even these are both Protestants, both cousins of our tradition. The Restoration movement would come out of these movements. They were persecuting each other in their own town in Connecticut. And that's where the importance of making sure when you codify things in law that everyone abides by, you don't get you don't legislate from the doctrinal the specifics of different variants of a faith is all I'm saying. So anyhow, thank you for this time. I'll put the recording up soon, and thank you for all of your comments, and we'll see you next week. Read chapter 6 and the corresponding scriptural verses. And we're going to be kind of stuck in chapter 12 of the book of Exodus for a couple more weeks running. So anyway, God bless, and have a good week.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Everybody. Okay. Bye-bye.